Right then, Hollywood loves selling ya a good story. And what's a better story then? Well, the greatest story ever told. They want you to remember the 1965 film The Greatest Story Ever Told as a masterpiece, a reverent, epic, Oscar-worthy monument to faith. A film made by a cinematic saint, George Stevens, that was destined for glory, grand. That's the all guff they peddle in the brochures. That's the lie. But the real story? The one with the carry-on, the blizzards in the deserts, and John Wayne as a Roman? The real story is about how one man's notions and a studio's arrogance turned the life of Jesus into an absolute hames. Come, I'll tell you about the absolute dog's dinner they made of it. So what was the big idea? You gotta understand the time. This is the late 50s, early 60s, and the studios, the old empires, they are running scared. This little box called television is keeping everyone at home. The only way to get them out is with a colossal epic, a roadshow, something so massive you had to see it on a giant screen. And the perfect recipe for a colossal epic? The Good Book. The 10 Commandments in 56 made a fortune, Ben-Hur in 59, it made an obscene fortune and won 11 Oscars. The lesson was simple, biblical, spells, money. So every studio was hunting for its own religious cash cow. Over at 20th Century Fox, a producer named George Stevens had been trying to get his own Jesus movie off the ground for years, based on a popular book. Stevens wasn't some hack. He was George Stevens, the man who made Shane, A Place in the Sun, Giant, an Oscar-winning legend. He was, to put it mildly, getting paid more than God. But this wasn't just a gig for him. No, Stevens had notions. See, during World War II, he led a film unit for the US Army. He was one of the first people to film the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. He saw things that changed him. He came back to Hollywood, a different man, a more serious man. He decided that the world, after all that horror, needed a definitive, reverent and slow film about the life of Christ. This wasn't a movie to him, it was a crusade, a sacred duty. Fox, however, was already busy making an absolute hames of its own, a little film called Cleopatra. So Stevens' project went into turnaround. But then, the studio United Artists, or UA, stepped in. UA was a different kind of studio. They were desperate for a prestige picture, a massive epic that would put them on the same level as MGM or Paramount. They saw George Stevens, the revered artist, and his sacred project, and they didn't just see a movie, they saw Oscars, they saw respect, they saw Ben-Hur money. They went to Stevens and they gave him the one thing that is pure poison in Hollywood. They gave him a blank check. George, they said, this is your masterpiece. Whatever you want, whatever you need. The budget is unlimited. What a notion. So the recipe was set. The perfect recipe for success. Take the most beloved, most famous story in human history. Hire the most respected, Oscar-winning director in Hollywood. Give him an unlimited budget and total creative control, and just for good measure, stuff the film with every famous face you can find. What could possibly go wrong? This right here is the absolute peak of 1960s studio arrogance. The old guard, the bloated beast, convinced it could buy a masterpiece, convinced it could manufacture reverence. Get way out of that. They were about to learn a very, very expensive lesson. The film officially goes into pre-production in 1961. The budget is set at a tidy $8 million. The shoot is scheduled for a breezy 3 months. It would finish shooting 3 years later at a cost of over $20 million, the equivalent of more than $200 million today. So, what happens? Murphy's Law, that's what. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. This wasn't a film set, it was a circus. The first problem was the man in charge, George Stevens. The man who came back from the war wasn't just serious, he was reverent to the point of paralysis. He was convinced he wasn't just making a movie, he was testifying. And this meant he became the slowest director in human history. He was acting de maggot on a celestial scale. He'd shoot a simple scene, like Jesus saying one line, then he'd look at it, and he'd shake his head, no, let's do it again. Then he'd move the camera, again, then he'd change the lens. Again. Then he'd wait for a cloud to move. Again. He'd shoot the same line, the same single line, 50 or 60 times, from every conceivable angle. He was shooting millions of feet of film searching for, well, only God knew what. The actors were going mad. Charlton Heston, who was playing John the Baptist, was used to this kind of epic, but even he was losing his mind. He said later, the only way to survive a Stevens film was to bring a good book. The cast and crew started calling him the Great Stoneface because he'd just stand there for hours, saying nothing while the clock was ticking, but Stevens didn't care. He had Final Cut, he had an unlimited budget. He had his notions. Stevens decided early on that he didn't want a movie star to play Jesus. He didn't want the audience thinking about some Hollywood fella. He wanted a pure face, an unknown. He found him in Sweden, Max von Sydow. Von Sydow was a brilliant actor, a star of Ingmar Bergman's films. He was serious, he was intense. He was very Scandinavian, and Stevens decided to turn him into a prisoner. Von Sydow signed a contract that was pure head-the-ball territory. For the entire production, which remember stretched into years, he was forbidden from being seen in public, going to a bar, going to a restaurant, giving any interviews, being photographed. He basically couldn't even go to Las Vegas, which was just down the road from the set. He had to be Jesus 24/7. He had to eat his meals alone in his hotel room. Stevens wanted to preserve the mystery. The poor fella was miserable. He was a non-English speaking Swede stuck in the middle of the Nevada desert, and he wasn't allowed to talk to anyone. He said later, I came to Hollywood to film the greatest story ever told, and I lost my smile. You can see it in the film. He's not just serene, he's catatonic. He looks less like the Son of God and more like a man who's been held hostage by a studio for 3 years. Alright, so you've got a director who's acting DeMaga and a star who's in solitary confinement. Where do you shoot this thing? The Holy Land? Israel? Stevens looked at the real Holy Land and said it was too small. He said it was all farmed out and didn't look biblical enough. No, George Stevens needed something epic. Something grand. Something American. He decided to shoot the greatest story ever, told in Utah and Nevada and Arizona. He literally decided that the American Southwest, the home of the John Ford Western, would stand in for the Holy Land. Jesus was now a cowboy. A Nevada Jesus. And this is where Murphy's Law went from a slight problem to an absolute hames. Stevens plants his entire massive production with thousands of extras in the middle of the desert. He's ready to shoot his sun-baked epic, so naturally, it snowed. I'm not joking. The production was hit by the worst winter in Nevada history. Blizzards, freezing cold, snow. They were trying to film the Sermon on the Mount, and there's snow on the ground. They had to hire crews with helicopters to fly low and dry the ground. They were painting rocks to cover the white patches. They were importing palm trees and wearing them to the rocks so they wouldn't blow away in the gales. The whole thing was a circus. They needed a Sea of Galilee. So they used Pyramid Lake in Nevada. The disciples, dressed in their thin biblical robes, were pushing their boats out onto this lake in near freezing temperatures. They were turning blue. They needed a River Jordan for John the Baptist. They dammed up a section of the Colorado River. It looked grand. And the moment they were ready to shoot, a flash flood came roaring down the canyon and washed the entire multi-million-dollar set away. The whole production was cursed. It was a logistical nightmare of, well, biblical proportions, and the whole time, the meter is running. The budget, which was 8 million, passed 10 million. Then 12 million. Then 15 million. The studio, United Artists, is in a full-blown panic. This can't-miss masterpiece is now a bloated beast that's eaten all their money, which leads to the final, most head-the-ball decision of all. The executives at UA are looking at the books, they're looking at the calendar, they're looking at their unknown Swedish star who looks like he's about to cry, and they panic. The film's gonna bomb! They cry. This Stevens fella is making some slow, weird art film. We need stars! The people want stars! So they decided to fixed the problem by stuffing the film, every single frame, with famous faces. They called in every favor, they offered huge paychecks for one day's work. This wasn't a movie, it was a telethon. And the result? The result is one of the most distracting, unintentionally hilarious films ever made. You're trying to watch this reverent story, and suddenly, there's Pat Boone as the angel at the tomb, in a little white skirt. There's Shelley Winters as Woman Who Is Healed. There's Ed Wynn, the comedian, as Old Aram. There's Sidney Poitier as Simon of Cyrene, carrying the cross. Is that Angela Lansbury, Carol Baker, Sal Mineo, Jamie Farr from MASH? It's an absolute circus. Every time a new character shows up, the audience is ripped out of the story, playing Spot the Star. It's a dog's dinner, but there is one cameo, one moment, the one that killed the film. The one that became a punchline for all eternity. The Crucifixion. This is it. The climax. The most sacred, powerful moment in the Christian faith. Jesus is on the cross. The sky is dark. The music is swelling. And a Roman centurion steps up. He looks up at the cross, and he has to deliver the single most important line of recognition in the whole story. And the centurion is John Wayne. John Wayne, he's there, in his Roman armor. And in his thick, unmistakable cowboy drawl, he looks up and he says, "Truly, this was the Son of God." The legend goes that Stevens, the great stone face, wanted more from him. "Give me more awe, Duke," he shouted. And Wayne, who had no idea what he was even doing there, supposedly growled back, "Ah, George, I can't give you awe. All I can give you is, truly, this was the Son of God." When the film premiered, audiences laughed. They burst out laughing. At the Crucifixion, when the audience laughs at the most sacred moment of your multi-million-dollar religious epic, your film is dead. It's over. After years of shooting, Stevens finally raps, and he disappears into the editing room for a year. He's in there with millions of feet of film. All his coverage, all his 50 takes of the same line. He finally emerges with his masterpiece, his grand vision. The film's original cut was 4 hours and 20 minutes. The studio executives at UA, who are now just grey, shaken husks of men, sat down to watch it, and they were horrified. It wasn't just long, it was boring. It was reverent to the point of paralysis. It was slow, it was ponderous, it was a disaster. They begged him to cut it. He refused. They fought. Lawsuits were threatened. Finally, a shorter version was released for the premiere, 3 hours and 42 minutes. The critics, who had been waiting for this masterpiece for years, took out their knives. They called it the greatest story ever sold. They called it boring, ponderous, and a colossal bore. One critic said, "It is reverent to the point where it becomes passionless." The film was a catastrophic bomb. It was a financial black hole. UA, in a final act of desperation, yanked the film from theaters. They cut it again, this time against Stevens' wishes. They hacked it down to 2 hours and 25 minutes, chopping out entire sections. So now the film wasn't just slow and boring, it was also a complete mess that made no sense. It was an absolute hames. So what killed the film? Was it John Wayne? Was it the snow? Was it the Nevada Jesus? Get away out of that. The film was dead before the first camera rolled. This wasn't a movie, it was a monument to one man's ego and a studio's arrogance. This is the 1960s studio system in a nutshell. A bloated beast, getting notions about itself. George Stevens, the great auteur, forgot he was a filmmaker. He thought he was a prophet. He was acting de maggot, and nobody had the guts to tell him no. And the studio, United Artists, thought they could buy reverence. They thought they could buy a masterpiece just by throwing money at it. They thought the perfect recipe of an epic, the Bible, and a big shot director couldn't possibly fail. But as me Allfella used to say, a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. Everyone could see this was a disaster except the people in charge. The film cost over 20 million. It made, next to nothing. It nearly sank United Artists. It destroyed George Stevens' career. He'd only make one more film. It was a colossal gamble that proved the old ways were finished. The studio was a rotten ship, and the greatest story ever told was the iceberg. It was a massive, expensive, hollow monument. So now you know the real story. Right, I'm off. Sláinte.